A major surprise as Corey Davis retires from the NFL. We'll discuss it today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, August 24th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangreneNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONNFL to get $20 off your first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Well, major news came out yesterday for the New York Jets, and they are losing a player as Corey Davis has decided to retire from the NFL. The veteran receiver who spent the last 2 seasons with the Jets after spending the early part of his career with the Tennessee Titans indicated that he's been thinking about retiring for a long time, and he announces his retirement on August 23rd, right before the Jets' final preseason game. And it's a move that has major implications for this team because Corey Davis was projected to be a starting receiver for this team, and I think probably the second best receiver on the team. Other than Garrett Wilson, I think he was the best receiver. So I think he was projected to be the number 2 receiver. You could argue maybe he was the number 3 receiver. Nonetheless, a very important player for this team heading into the 2023 season. So the Jets will have to figure out how to work around a lack of Corey Davis. And one thing that comes to mind for me in situations like this is that I'm never going to pass any sort of judgment on a player for retiring. I'm not the one who has to play. These are the guys who go out there and put their bodies on the line week after week. These are the guys who sacrifice so much to play in the NFL. And if a player doesn't have the fire to continue playing, if a player just decides, you know what, I want to do something else with my life, I always wish him well, because there's nothing I can do to tell a guy he has to play. It's ultimately the player's decision. So I think the first thing I'd say is that I wish Corey Davis very well in his retirement. I hope he finds happiness. Robert Saleh has indicated the Jets will welcome Davis back with open arms if he does change his mind, although I'm not sure I would necessarily expect that. I think there's no question about it. This opens up a bit of a hole in the Jets receiving group. It's not one that's insurmountable, but the Jets receiving group is less talented today than it was yesterday. And the Jets do pick up some cap space, so they gain about $10.5 million in salary cap space. Quite frankly, that's not significant for this year. I think it helps the Jets more next year because you can roll over unused salary cap space. So for every dollar you don't spend this year, you get an extra dollar in salary cap space next year. And Jets are facing a pretty tight cap in the years ahead. So I think this year, I don't think it matters for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's too late to sign any player who's that significant. I mean, yeah, there's a couple of guys out there. Jets did just sign Dalvin Cook, so you can't say it's impossible. But I think at this time of the year, if you get somebody, you're kind of lucky. It's not something you can count on. It's one of those things where it's possible, but it's not something that you can count on. So I don't think it really matters from that standpoint. The second thing is that Aaron Rodgers giving back the money that he gave the Jets all the cap space they need to add any players this year anyway. So I don't think that the cap number really matters this year. I think it does help the Jets going forward because that's $10.5 million. They probably won't spend because I don't think the Jets will be able to spend all their money this year. So maybe they'll have $10.5 million extra next year because they won't be spending that money on Corey Davis. But I think that this is a move by Davis that, again, I want to be very careful in how I phrase this because I respect Corey Davis's decision. I think that each player needs to make their own call. I had big expectations for Corey Davis this year. I think Jets fans have been too down on him. I think first of all, he's a consummate professional. I think he's the type of guy you always like in your locker room. I think he's been a net positive in the New York Jets locker room the last 2 years. The on the field stuff has not gone so well for him. I think if we're being fair, he's been a disappointment as a free agent addition. And I think maybe he gets a little bit too much criticism because when the Jets signed him, there was this perception that they were going out to get him to be a number one receiver. And I never thought that was the case. And if you look at the money he was getting, and if you compare it to the money that goes to wide receivers in this day and age, it really was not number one receiver money. That said, there were some very disappointing moments for Davis. There were too many drops. And unfortunately, he struggled with his ability to stay on the field. And that's not his fault, but you are judged by what you produce, and you can't produce when you're not on the field. But Corey Davis is a better receiver than he's shown the last 2 years. I thought he was a strong bounce back candidate with Aaron Rodgers around, and I'm kind of disappointed we won't be able to see Davis catch passes from Rodgers. Now, one other aspect of this is that there have been these rumors swirling the last couple of weeks that the Jets wanted him to take a pay cut, maybe stay around for less salary. There are also rumors that maybe the Jets perhaps were looking at trading him. I hope that did not play a role in this. I mean, that's the one thing I would say is that, and I have no evidence to suggest that this was anything that happened, but this would not be a good move by the Jets. I'll say this: if the Jets were trying to get him to take a pay cut at this time of year, now earlier in the offseason, it's a different story. I think when you ask a player to take a pay cut early in the offseason, you have a lot of leverage. It's not so much you have a lot of leverage; it's that if the player doesn't take the pay cut and you cut him, you at least have a mechanism to replace him. If you do it before free agency, you say take a pay cut or we're going to release you. If the player decides to be released, then you as a team can have a pretty good shot at finding another free agent or making a trade to replace that guy. This time of year, the Jets really did not have the same degree of leverage because they don't really have a mechanism to make an external replacement of Davis. So I'm hoping that they did not do it that way. I'm hoping that this is not a situation where Davis was maybe pondering retirement. And again, I have no evidence to suggest this is the case. I'm just saying I hope it's not the case. That the Jets I hope that the Jets did not kind of press Davis to take a pay cut. And then maybe if Davis was thinking about retiring, it gave him the final push. Again, I'm not suggesting that this is the case, but I hope that that's not what's happening because the Jets are all in this year. Jets are trying to win a Super Bowl. The Jets have already kind of decided we're just going to maximize this year. We're going to max out our cap space. So the $10.5 million, I think it'll help the Jets going forward, but it's not the type of thing that materially changes their cap positioning for the years ahead. It's going to be a tight cap. The Jets are going all in this year. They're trying to win big. They have Aaron Rodgers for the next year, maybe 2 years. So you essentially need to load up the roster this year. And I think unfortunately for the Jets, it's not like you lost Garrett Wilson. It's not like you lost a star player, but you lost a guy who projected as a very valuable role player, a guy whose production probably would have gone up quite a bit with Aaron Rodgers under center, and a guy who was due for a good year because he's a better player than he's shown the last couple of years. I do wish Corey Davis well, however. Ahead here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about who needs to step up in place of Corey Davis. Jets have lost their number 2 receiver, so this is going to open up some opportunities for other guys, and we'll discuss who as we continue this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. Now, if you've been listening the last couple of days, you know I'm in London right now, and unfortunately, I'm leaving today. I'm probably heading to the airport shortly after I finish recording this podcast about Corey Davis. Really sad about that. It's been a great trip. We got to see an English Premier League match Monday night. I've been to the West End to see a couple shows the last couple of days. Fortunately, I booked my tickets in advance, but I know that's not always possible. That's where Game Time comes in. Buying tickets to your favorite events should not be stressful. Game Time is the fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. With killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, comedy, concerts, theaters, and more. The Game Time guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. You can get images of your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Buy tickets in a matter of seconds. And you're set. Tickets are sent directly to your phone, so you'll never have to dig through your email. Snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase, and enjoy. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And once again, a big shout out to Locked On Jets listeners in the United Kingdom. It's been a wonderful week for me in London as I get ready to head to the airport shortly after finishing recording this podcast. Can't tell you how beautiful London is. And believe it or not, the United Kingdom is actually the third biggest country when we talk about listeners of the Locked On Jets podcast. So I know we have a lot of listeners out there. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. But today we're talking about Corey Davis. The Jets veteran wide receiver decides abruptly to announce his retirement on Wednesday. This means that other guys have to step up. Now, I think the most obvious guy is Allen Lazard. There's this debate that's been going on in the Jets fan base. Who's the number 2 receiver? Is it Lazard? Is it Davis? Well, I don't think there's any debate anymore. Allen Lazard is the number 2 receiver, but there's more pressure on Allen Lazard now to produce, because when you have like a 2A situation, that at least, if Lazard's the 3, he's a high-end number 3 receiver. Or if Davis is the 3, he's a high-end number 3 receiver. And that means you need to get less from your number 2 guy. Now the Jets have Lazard clearly as the number 2 guy. Their number 3 guy, it's Mecole Hardman. And when we talk about players who are impacted by this, Hardman might be impacted even more than Allen Lazard, because I got to be honest with you, I was looking at this roster and I had no idea where Hardman fit in. And it was almost like the Jets signed him for a different plan way back when at the beginning of free agency, because they gave him like a $6 million contract, and his projected role on this team was to really be a gadget guy and mainly to be a returner. Well, that changes now. I think Hardman is now looking at stepping into the starting lineup. We know Randall Cobb. I don't think Randall Cobb was going to be a starter. I think he was probably the number 4 receiver, but he's the number 4 receiver who's going to be important to this team. He's going to be on the field an awful lot, and Aaron Rodgers has a lot of trust in him, so he'll probably go to Cobb on a lot of key downs. But Hardman kind of jumps in the hierarchy quite a bit here, because he was a guy who it was difficult to figure out what his role was. And I've talked about this, how this offseason kind of felt like there were 2 parallel off seasons. There was the Aaron Rodgers offseason, where the Jets got Rodgers and they got a bunch of his teammates from Green Bay, guys that he likes being around. And then there was the typical Joe Douglas offseason. And Hardman's like kind of a typical Joe Douglas type of signing. Joe Douglas loves betting on draft pedigree in free agency. He loves betting on guys with big athletic profiles. And he likes getting guys who were early round picks, who maybe were a little disappointing in their first stop in the NFL, trying to roll the dice on them, giving them a moderately priced contract and hoping that they break out. And that's like Hardman down. That is like the perfect description of Mecole Hardman. Well, now Hardman has a major role on this team. And I think it adds a bit of a different dimension to this offense, because when you're talking about Lazard and you're talking about Davis together, you don't really have a great deep threat there. I think they're both more possession type receivers. And you have Garrett Wilson as kind of your go-to guy. Hardman's a guy who stretches the field, and more playing time for him potentially could make the Jets offense actually a little bit more explosive. He'll add a big play threat because he's got deep speed. He's also got an ability to be, again, a gadget guy. I thought he was going to play that role anyway, but I think it's a little bit easier now to disguise the gadget plays, because when Corey Davis is on the team and Hardman has a very limited role, it's going to stick out when he's on the field. You know that they're either going to probably fake a gadget play to him or try and get him the ball in space, or he's either he's going to be a decoy or he's going to get a chance to make a play, because he just wouldn't have many snaps. Now that he's a full-time receiver, defenses won't be able to key on him quite as much. So I think this could be the type of thing that perhaps makes those plays a bit more effective. And I think that Hardman brings an element of explosive plays. Now, he didn't produce them enough in Kansas City, and there's a part of me that thinks that if you can't produce it in a big way with the Chiefs, with Patrick Mahomes throwing you the ball, with Andy Reid scheming things up for you, are things really going to get that much better? Well, the Jets are going to need Mecole Hardman now. And a move that, frankly, seemed extraneous a day ago, and now it becomes pretty important, because now the Jets starting 3 receivers are Garrett Wilson, who's excellent, really solid number 1 and ascending young player. At number 2, you have Allen Lazard, who, if nothing else, does have good chemistry with Aaron Rodgers. Mecole Hardman now steps into that number 3 role. So we'll see how these guys handle this. But the 2 guys who are most impacted, I think, are Lazard, who now has a lot more on him. Even if Lazard was the number 2 with Davis in the mix, now you don't have as strong of a number 3. So that means the number 2 needs to produce more. And then Hardman, who steps into Davis's starting role, presumably, unless and Randall Cobb could get a few more snaps. But those are the two guys who are most impacted, at least as far as playing time goes. There is, however, one other implication of this move. It opens up a roster spot, perhaps for a young player to snag. And as we continue this Thursday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about how this could impact the Jets at the bottom of the roster. I'll give you some thoughts ahead here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Thursday, discussing the retirement of Corey Davis. Now, this move by Davis has a bit of a domino effect on the Jets roster. We just talked about how it moves Alan Lazard up to the number 2 receiver role. It moves Mecole Hardman up to the number 3 receiver role. But it also opens up a spot on the 53-man roster for a young player to claim. The Jets are going to have one of the oldest 53-man rosters in the league this season. And one of the things I've been least comfortable with is how many older players are taking up depth spots on the roster. And this is a really small thing that people don't notice because it only has an impact years down the line. So people don't really put the connection together. And people don't really care about it. But you should, in my view, as an NFL team, have the bottom of your roster populated by young developmental players. And the reason for that is they're the ones who will most benefit from the practice reps. An older player who's not really playing much, they're not really going to benefit from practicing. And if you have like an old guy as your number 5 receiver, it's not going to help your team at all because he's not going to play and he's not going to develop at all from the practice reps he gets. And it's not that like any single player has a very good chance of becoming a quality NFLer in a few years with practice reps, but the more young players you put at the bottom of your roster, the better chance you have of finding one. So if I have one young player in a developmental role who's like my number 6 receiver, yeah, the odds are against him. But if I have a guy taking up if I have a young guy taking up my last receiver spot and my last defensive line spot and my last offensive line spot, those things start to add up. And if you have like 7 to 10 young players at the bottom of your roster trying to develop in practice, the odds of finding one of them is pretty good. And those little things make a difference. It's not like one player turns you from the worst team in the NFL to a Super Bowl team, but it's these little things that the good teams do. And these are things that kind of fly under the radar. And the retirement of Davis now gives the Jets a chance to add an extra young player at the bottom of their roster. There's an old expression in baseball. If you want to find a good pitching prospect, start with 5 pitching prospects. The same goes with football prospects, especially developmental guys, late round picks, undrafted free agent types. Most of them don't pan out. The more of them you have on your team, the better your odds are of finding one. It's not that you load an entire 53-man roster with these young developmental players, but it's that the more of them you have, the better the chance you have that one of them will pan out. And now there's an extra spot at the receiver position. And this is one of the things I've been least comfortable with. And this goes back to why I thought Hardman was kind of extraneous before the Davis retirement, is that the Jets essentially had 5 receiver spots locked up. You had Garrett Wilson, you had Davis, Lazard's going to be here, Cobb's going to be here because Aaron Rodgers loves him. You had Hardman. You're usually not going to carry more than 6 receivers, so that really only left one spot open. And it could have been Jason Brownlee, it could have been Xavier Gibson, a couple other guys who could be in the mix. Well, now you have an extra spot. So now you have 2 spots going to young players, presumably. And that means only one of the 2. If you want to, a couple of years down the line, develop one of these guys, and hopefully they become a contributor for this team, even if they're just like a role player, even if they're not a starter, even if they're not like a number 2 type receiver, you now have you not only need 50% of them to develop into a good player. You need 1 out of 2. Your odds are now much better. So I think that it does open up an opportunity at the bottom of the roster. And I don't want to overstate how significant this is because, again, when we're talking about developmental players, they usually don't pan out. And it's kind of the old lottery ticket analogy. The more lottery tickets you have, the better your odds are of winning. Now, the odds of a developmental young player in the NFL are much better than the odds of you winning the lottery. But I'd like to have as many chances as I can, especially in roles where guys aren't really going to see much playing time. And I wouldn't want like a young developmental player as my number 3 receiver. That's the Mike McCagnon Jets. But I want as many young developmental players on the roster spots where you're not going to see much playing time anyway, because that means you're maximizing that roster spot. That means you're giving yourself as good of a chance as possible to find a quality player, young player. So an extra roster spot now opens up for the Jets. So at the top of the roster, I think it's, it hurts the Jets. The Jets are a worse team than they were yesterday. But one of the benefits here, and there are a couple of benefits, is it gives you a chance to step up. And the Jets do have some degree of insurance there with Mecole Hardman able to step into the starting lineup. So anyway, those are my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but that's all for today. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the show. Hope you have a great Thursday, everybody. I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be back in the United States. Talk to you then.